Good evening, everybody. This is Michael Pelias for Jazz Chronicles from New York City. You've been listening to the great alto saxist Lee Konitz with Lennie Tristano doing All the Things You Are from the 1950s. One of the great alto sax players of that period and a man still alive today. Tonight we're going to title the show Lee Konitz and the Art of Improvisation, and we're going to be doing a lot of work around the relationship of Lee Konitz to certain pianists, great pianists, such as Lennie Tristano, who he built his career with and actually attended the school of the great Lennie Tristano here in Manhattan. And then, of course, the relationship to Bill Evans that took place in the 50s and somewhat in the 60s, more in Europe. We're going to hear some cuts from Copenhagen and from West Germany, Berlin, West Germany at that time. Also from Brad Mellow in the 1990s, where Konitz may return to a kind of traditional form of alto sax playing after great experimentation. And then we'll do some of his great experimentation, improvisation with the song of Half Nelson, and also then the improvisation of What Is This Thing Called Love, the Cole Porter song that he made famous as a new, what were called in the history of jazz, a counterfact. So we're going to go forward and hear a little more of Konitz. Konitz was born in 1927 in Chicago, Illinois, and started out playing for some of the big bands, Stan Kenton, for example, where he was highly exploited. He was on a kind of debtor's salary where he had to borrow money from the Kenton Orchestra to take care of his family during that time, which was kind of a practice, a kind of money lending happens sometimes in these big bands, and it's, you know, a kind of hidden history of jazz, which we'll explore in the future. But tonight, I just wanted to get started with Konitz as beginning in the big band era. But when he went to Tristano School, he began to emerge as a major improviser of the instrument of the alto sax, both as composer but as playing many of the popular tunes. So we're going to hear go forward a decade. And by the way, Lee Konitz is still alive. I hope he's in good health and lucid. He's would be 93 years old in October of next year. He's 92 right now, born in 1927 once again. And let's listen now to All the Things You Are, this time with Bill Evans and Konitz on the saxophone, and a group of a Danish bassist, Orster Petersen and Niels Herring, and Alan Dawson on drums. But really the combination of Evans and Konitz is the thing to listen to. This was much more improvised version than you heard from the 50s with Tristano. So you can begin to see him, you know, getting more and more into improvisation. So we're going to, again, concentrate on this period of the 50s to the 60s for the first part of this show. So that's a little more improvised version of all the things you are 10 years later in Copenhagen with the great Bill Evans on piano, and you can hear the difference between the form of and style of course, Bill Evans and Lennie Tristano, something that we will certainly devote an entire program to, again, coming up this year in 2020. Again, Lee Konitz is very interesting in the sense that he begins with the big band, plays bebop very early on, but he also then follows the birth of the cool and plays actually with Miles Davis on some cuts, and then goes forward, in some ways in a free jazz form, but not so much exactly like Ornette Coleman or the great Cecil Taylor, another, superb pianist that we need an entire several hours to deal with in the future. But, Konitz is very, very interesting in the sense that he was able to cross over many, many, jazz evolutionary forms, like I said, from the big band era to the bebop, then to the cool jazz, and then this incredible ability to improvise. We're going to see this counterfact a little later in terms of how he does a Cole Porter tune and just turns it almost completely around. We'll hear this later in the program. But for right now, we want to play another one of the great pieces, Come to Me, My Melancholy Baby, another classic that he does with Bill Evans in Copenhagen. And this is another, short listening pleasure for you. So that's Come to Me, My Melancholy Baby, with Konitz at his improvisational best, with, again, the great Bill Evans on piano in West Berlin in 1965, part of their European tour in 1965. And again, you get this incredible sense of this ability to improvise and work off of, a melody in such a way that makes a standard, almost completely revised, rewritten, rethought, and replayed, of course. So we're going to be moving on now to 30 years forward, Lee Konitz in 1997 with Brad Mehlau and Charlie Hayden in a performance they did with another version of What Is This Thing Called Love. This is in 1997. This is going to be a version of What Is This Thing Called Love, and we're going to juxtapose that afterwards with going back in time to Konitz's moment of What Is This Thing Called Love from Subconscious Lee. But first, 1997, the version of What Is This Thing Called Love with Charlie Hayden and Brad Mehlau on piano, a different kind of pianist, someone who is still operating today. And Konitz at this time is really, he's, almost 70 years old, so we can get an idea of him going back to the standard, but, playing it with interesting, improvisational things. But in my view, and this is, of course, for the listener to decide, but in my view, again, I want to emphasize that it seems to me he was more experimental in the 60s than in this 90s version. But we'll speak to that a little later. So there we go. You're talking about a man in his early 70s playing these kind of with these kind of chops. You can hear these long melodic lines where one signature is going over another. Pretty amazing, but still, I think, within the boundaries of the traditional. But amazing. The Konitz continued to grow, continued to experiment. Really, in a way, is you could really say one of the great survivors of this instrument, the alto sax, and what one could do with it. I want to, point out again that this is about an 11 and a half minute cut. What is this thing called Love with Brad Mailer? Certainly worth listening to because of also Charlie Hayden's guitar that we are not playing tonight, but certainly worth listening to that you can access. I want to move on to, and actually we're moving backwards in time. This is a kind of prospective, retrospective, or reading now where the retrospective is really kind of feeding, if you will, or interpreting the 1997 piece. This is 50 years earlier of Konitz doing his work on what is this thing called Love, called Subconscious Lee. Pretty amazing stuff here. This is another version of What Is This Thing Called Love, the standard, of course. Yeah, so that's Lee Konitz and the school of Lennie Tristano with Wayne Marsh as well. Some of the great students of the Manhattan studio and school of the great Lennie Tristano, pianist. You can hear the return sort of to the bebop era and Tristano's tremendous influence here. Again, time signatures over another. You're beginning to really see the development, if you will, very early experimental development of Lee Konitz in this. And I think it's good, again, that what we did is comparing this to the later version with Brad Mellow and Charlie Hayden of the 1990s, almost a half a century later. Playing on this. The influence of Lee Konitz was great on Paul Desmond and Art Pepper in particular, and of course the relationship somewhat to Steve Lacy and then Sam Rivers later on. This was really one of what one could call an alternative story of jazz outside the dominance of the Ellington, Armstrong, of course, then Mingus, Roach, and all the greats, Miles Davis, the kind of, if you will, cult of personality that went on in jazz for a long time. This was another story in the history of jazz. And part of what we're really trying to do here on Jazz Chronicles is to give you a very large panoramic view of the history of jazz, and at the same time, its effects both on the culture as well as on the political situation. Konitz, to the best of my knowledge, was not politically active. To his discredit, if you will, he joined the Scientologist movement in the 1970s, but it didn't seem to affect his playing at all. And, these things happen. Chick Corea actually probably recruited him to such a thing at that time. And, jazz musicians have a hard time making a living, and sometimes these kind of, small little community cults give them a way in terms of making new connections and all of that. So anyway, we're not going to hold this against him at all, given this artistry, etc. Just as a very much of a long footnote. So again, I want to emphasize, and certainly, one can, of course, write a long book about this and the art of improvisation, but the interesting thing here, again, is to trace this back to the Lennie Tristano school of an amazing group of players, which included Wayne Marsh and, of course, the great Lee Konitz. I want to move on here to a later thing, about 10 years later than this last version of this thing called Love. We're going to go to a piece called Half Nelson. Half Nelson is a term used in wrestling where you pin someone down between the neck and the arm. And this is kind of interesting. This is from a TV program called The Subject is Jazz. And this features Billy Taylor, another great pianist who emerged around this 1950s period, very relaxed pianist, one of the great postures at the piano that we've seen, and a very elegant player. This is from a TV program called The Subject is Jazz, and this was called American Music. And this is Konitz, and we're going to finish with this Half Nelson. I do want to mention before leaving, for Konitz, and we'll probably do maybe a part two, a short part two, and lead in backwards to the Tristano School on the next show. But the time at Storyville is very interesting at Copley Square Hotel, the great venue in Boston, Massachusetts, owned by George Wein, who was the founder of the Newport Jazz Festival. And we may play some of his work from that period as well. But again, I have a very good sampling here of who Lee Konitz is through his work on the saxophone. And again, I want to mention that this is really the art of improvisation at its best. Someone who could cross through the bebop era, the birth of the cool jazz, eventually, and the really long melodic lines that he experiments with is very important, and how he can add accents throughout part of this improvisational moment. And again, the great ability to take one time signature and impose it on another over another. So this is very interesting, and this is a testament, if you will, to the conscious Lee Konitz. So thank you so much, and we're going to hear Half Nelson, a piece done on American TV. The Subject is Jazz, 1958, featuring Billy Taylor on piano, of course, with the great Lee Konitz.
Now, are you going to put this together with the combo?
Yes, I'd like to. I'd like to demonstrate all of these things, and you can hear a difference in sonority between what it sounds like on the piano and what happens to it when you give these different parts to individual instruments, like this.
So thank you very, very much for listening to the wonderful improvisational art of the alto sax player Lee Konitz and his relationships to Lennie Tristano, Bill Evans, Brad Mailow, and finally Billy Taylor. And what a beautiful way to end with a nice hold in wrestling that's so sweet, half Nelson. We'll see you soon for the next program, which will be continuation of Konitz and then a foray into the notion of jazz and justice in the history of jazz. Thank you so much. Michael Pelias signing off for Jazz Chronicles from New York City.